The dense woods outside Savannah murmured with secrets no one dared speak aloud. Moonlight filtered through the thick canopy, casting long, trembling shadows across the cracked paths leading to the old plantation. I had arrived seeking stories of old southern charm, tales of sprawling gardens and genteel hospitality, but the air here smelled of something older, darker, a scent that clung to the skin and refused to be washed away. The house itself rose like a mausoleum of whispered sins, its white columns pale against the encroaching darkness, and behind its tall windows, the silhouettes of women moved with a strange, deliberate grace. The lady of the house welcomed me with a smile that did not reach her eyes, a beauty both commanding and unsettling, and I could not shake the sense that she watched not only me but everything I could not see, the forest, the slaves, the daughters who lingered in silence. Rumors had whispered their way to me, murmurs of forbidden nights, of obedience bought through fear and charm, of shadows that spoke louder than words. As evening deepened, the soft strains of laughter floated through the halls, hollow and echoing, and I realized the plantation did not merely conceal secrets, it nurtured them. Somewhere behind those walls, in the dim corridors where candlelight trembled against portraits of stern ancestors, the girls moved under the weight of a power that was both motherly and monstrous, and in the woods, the air itself seemed to pulse with the hushed cries of those who had no voice. I stepped closer, drawn by the strange, magnetic pull of what I was not supposed to see, and the night whispered back, voices in the dark, urging me to witness, to uncover, to understand, before the forest swallowed me whole. The first time I saw the plantation, it seemed to emerge from the mist like a ghost from some half-forgotten memory, its white columns barely visible through the dense tangle of moss-draped oaks. The road that led there was narrow and uneven, swallowed in parts by overgrown weeds, and each step deeper into the woods felt like a step away from the world I knew. Savannah's warmth and charm faded behind me as the shadows grew longer, and I began to feel the weight of the silence that clung to the air. Even the birds seemed absent here, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The rumors I had heard in town, whispers about the plantation lady and her daughters, hints of forbidden behavior hidden behind polite smiles and sprawling gardens, hovered at the edge of my mind, growing louder with each footfall. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, thick and almost tangible, as if the forest and the house itself were aware of my approach. When I finally glimpsed the estate through a gap in the trees, it struck me with a jarring contrast. The house was grand, almost regal, its pristine white paint and towering columns projecting an air of wealth and power, yet it carried a subtle unease, a feeling that elegance had been draped over something corrupt. Smoke from the chimneys curled lazily into the twilight, but it smelled not of warm hearths but of something faintly acrid, something that hinted at toil and tension rather than comfort. The grounds were meticulously maintained in places, flower beds bursting with color and trimmed hedges lining the driveway, but in others, the grass grew wild and unkempt, as though the earth itself resisted order. Shadows seemed to linger unnaturally beneath the gnarled trees, stretching like silent sentinels who observed every movement, every whisper. Approaching the front entrance, I felt the unsettling sensation of being watched. It was not the casual scrutiny of a household expecting a visitor, but something sharper, more calculating. The air itself seemed to hum with expectation, as if the house and its occupants were anticipating my arrival, weighing my presence and intentions before I even crossed the threshold. Through the tall, glass-paned doors, I could glimpse fleeting movements, figures gliding along the corridors, a flash of silk, a shadow that vanished before I could focus. The daughters of the house remained elusive, their presence suggested rather than revealed, and yet I sensed them everywhere, in the quiet sway of curtains, in the faint scent of perfume carried on the breeze, in the subtle echo of laughter that seemed just out of reach. The plantation felt alive, and not in the ordinary sense of life, but in the way a predator observes, silently, patiently, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. The first time I truly saw them, the family appeared almost as if conjured from the shadows themselves, their presence both commanding and unnervingly fragile. The plantation lady emerged from the doorway with the slow grace of someone who had rehearsed every movement, every smile, every tilt of the head to perfection, yet there was a coldness beneath it, an undercurrent of control that made the air around her seem taut. She was tall, her posture rigid, her dress immaculate, a swath of white and lavender fabric that clung to her like a shroud, and her eyes were sharp, calculating, a piercing gray that seemed to weigh my every thought before I could speak it. There was no warmth in her greeting, only the precise politeness of someone accustomed to having power and ensuring it remained unquestioned. Her voice was soft but unwavering, carrying the subtle authority of a ruler who demanded obedience without ever raising her tone, and yet even in that controlled serenity, there lingered a strange, almost magnetic danger that made my pulse tighten in the presence of someone I instinctively feared and could not fully trust. Behind her, the daughters glided along the hallway like phantoms, their movements almost synchronized, measured, as if rehearsed for some audience unseen. They were beautiful in a way that made the stomach churn, pale and poised with delicate features and long, dark hair that fell like curtains around their shoulders, yet something in their eyes betrayed a haunting resignation, a quiet despair that flickered behind practiced smiles. Occasionally, one of them would glance in my direction, and the brief flicker of recognition in her gaze felt weighted with a secret too heavy to bear, a silent acknowledgement of the darkness that governed their lives. They were polite, gracious even, offering a soft nod or gentle curtsy, but the gestures felt hollow, as if they were performing a ritual rather than expressing genuine hospitality. Even as I stood in the foyer, the air itself seemed to pulse with tension, as though the walls and polished floors had absorbed decades of fear and whispered compliance, and now every creak underfoot, every rustle of fabric, carried the weight of invisible chains. I could sense the careful choreography of glances and gestures, the subtle ways in which the mother maintained dominance over her daughters with a quiet, almost surgical precision. The house, the women, and the servants all moved in a rhythm that was unsettling in its perfection, a carefully maintained illusion of civility concealing the oppressive gravity of control. And while the daughters appeared graceful and composed, there was a fragility to them, a silent tremor that hinted at lives dictated by a force beyond their choosing, lives tethered to secrets too shameful to speak aloud yet impossible to escape. It wasn't long before I realized that the real stories of the plantation lived not in the halls of the grand house, but in the quiet corners where the enslaved workers moved like shadows. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices almost swallowed by the thick humidity and the dense canopy of the surrounding woods. When they thought no outsider could hear, fragments of words would escape, carried on the breeze like fragile, secret warnings. I overheard murmurs of nights filled with commands that were never spoken aloud, of daughters drawn into rituals that twisted obedience and desire into something horrifyingly unnatural. Their eyes, when they dared to meet mine, were wide with fear and the weight of knowledge no one should bear. There was a tension in the air between them, a silent understanding of unspoken rules and punishments, and the glances exchanged in the fields or along the narrow paths were fraught with dread. Some spoke of the lady of the house with a reverent terror, calling her Mrs. in the same breath as trembling at what she demanded in the privacy of her chambers. They hinted at a meticulous cruelty, an ability to control not through overt violence but through fear, shame, and psychological dominance. Nights were the worst, they said, when the candles burned low and the wind pressed against the walls, bringing with it the faintest echo of screams that could not be traced, of laughter that felt unnatural, chillingly hollow. The daughters, according to their whispers, were both victims and instruments, bound to follow their mother's will with a mixture of resignation and learned submission, as though the house itself had taught them obedience. Even in the daytime, the tension never fully lifted. The workers moved with a caution that suggested any misstep could bring wrath down upon them, and yet in the flicker of a shadow or a whispered phrase, one could see the fragments of defiance that refused to be fully extinguished. They spoke of secret glances and small gestures of rebellion, of moments when the daughters' smiles faltered or hands trembled as if trying to push against invisible chains. These were the pieces that formed the mosaic of life under the plantation's roof, a life meticulously curated by a matriarch whose reach extended far beyond what the casual visitor could see. I felt the weight of their fear pressing upon me as I listened, an invisible burden that seemed to seep into my bones. Every whispered story carried a warning, a silent plea to understand the darkness that thrived behind the veneer of wealth and civility. There was a rhythm to their words, a cadence born of shared terror, and it was clear that the plantation was not merely a home but a crucible where power, manipulation, and control fused into a force that left no one untouched. Even standing at the edge of the woods, I felt the gravity of their unspoken truth, as if the whispers themselves were a tether, pulling me toward a horror I was not yet prepared to witness. It happened by accident, or perhaps by some quiet insistence of fate, that I stumbled upon the first tangible evidence of the plantation's hidden horrors. I had been wandering the edges of the library, drawn by the scent of aged paper and candle wax, when a door slightly ajar caught my attention. The wood was warped with age, its brass handle tarnished, yet the faint glow inside suggested someone had been there recently. Pushing it open, I discovered a small, dimly lit study tucked away behind shelves of leather-bound volumes and forgotten ledgers. The air was heavy with dust and the subtle musk of perfume, a strange mixture that somehow felt both inviting and threatening. At first glance, it seemed no different from any ordinary room in the house, yet the neatness of the furniture and the arrangement of objects spoke of careful concealment rather than comfort. On the desk lay a stack of papers, yellowed with age and bound with a fraying ribbon, their edges curling as though the weight of their content threatened to spill into the room itself. I picked up the first letter with trembling hands, scanning the delicate, looping handwriting. It was addressed to no one yet seemed meant for the eyes of someone who already understood the unspoken rules of the house. The words were gentle on the surface, polite and measured, yet the meaning beneath was unmistakable, a careful documentation of obedience, manipulation, and compliance, detailing how the daughters were guided, coerced, and controlled. Each letter, each journal entry, painted a vivid picture of a life orchestrated entirely by the matriarch, a web of domination that extended into the daughters' nights, into the very rooms I had glimpsed through half-closed doors. There were other tokens as well, small trinkets, a ribbon torn from a gown, a locket with initials scratched into its surface, all pointing to moments the daughters might have cherished yet were now stained with the weight of secrecy. It became clear that this study, hidden from plain sight, was a vault of the plantation's darkest truths, preserved in meticulous detail as though the matriarch herself wished someone, anyone, to eventually understand the depth of her control. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, not only because of what I had uncovered, but because I now understood the scale of the deception I had glimpsed in fleeting shadows and whispered stories. These were not mere rumors or the idle gossip of fearful servants. The evidence lay here in ink and paper, undeniable and undeniable in its intent. I knew then that the plantation was more than a house of wealth and charm, it was a carefully maintained theater of terror, and I had just stepped behind the curtains. The woods behind the plantation had always seemed to loom with a presence of their own, an unspoken authority that made even the bravest of men hesitate at their edge. At first, they appeared merely dense, an impenetrable tangle of oaks, pines, and thick undergrowth, but as I ventured closer, it became clear that the forest was far from passive. Shadows shifted with a life of their own, and the faint rustle of leaves carried whispers that seemed to come from nowhere yet felt intimately directed at anyone who dared to tread beneath the canopy. The sunlight barely pierced the branches, leaving the ground in a perpetual twilight where roots snaked across the soil like serpents, ready to trip the unwary, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a place that seemed to breathe with secrets, a living extension of the house's dark influence, and I could not shake the feeling that every step deeper into the trees brought me closer to truths I was unprepared to face. At night, the forest transformed entirely. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying what sounded like distant, muffled voices, some plaintive, some commanding, and others that I could not place at all, as though the earth itself remembered and spoke of sins long buried. The shadows cast by the moon were sharp and shifting, creating illusions of movement that made me glance over my shoulder again and again, certain I was being followed. In the faint flicker of candlelight from the house, the trees seemed to lean closer, pressing inward as if to protect or conceal something that existed only within their grasp. The plantation's daughters had once wandered these woods, the whispers suggested, drawn into its obscurity by forces that were both invisible and terrifyingly precise, and the slaves spoke of signs, broken branches, footprints, and hidden paths, that bore witness to actions they dared not describe aloud. It was easy to feel disoriented, lost even, for the forest had no clear paths, only trails marked by fleeting signs that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Every sound, the distant crack of a twig, the sudden flutter of a bird, the low hum of wind through the pines, felt exaggerated, amplified by the mind's growing awareness that this place was alive, watching, and remembering. The trees seemed to echo the house's control, extending its reach beyond the walls and into the lives of everyone who crossed its boundary. Standing at the edge of the hidden woods, I understood that they were not merely a backdrop to the plantation's secrets but an accomplice, holding the whispers, the cries, and the invisible chains that bound the daughters and the enslaved alike. They existed as both witness and prison, a place where the boundary between fear and reality blurred, and where any who ventured too far risked seeing truths that would haunt them long after they returned to the sunlit world beyond the tree-line. It was late in the evening, the kind of oppressive heat that clung to the skin and made the air thick, when I first witnessed the full weight of the plantation's control. I had been wandering through the corridors, drawn by the soft flicker of candlelight and the faint strains of music that seemed almost ritualistic in their slow, deliberate cadence. A door left slightly ajar revealed a scene I could not have imagined, a tableau of dominance that made the blood in my veins run cold. The mother stood at the center of the room, her posture rigid, her face serene yet unyielding, radiating an authority so absolute it seemed to warp the very air around her. Her daughters were there, their movements hesitant, measured, each gesture dictated by an unspoken rule that I could feel pressing against my chest even from the doorway. I froze, caught between the need to flee and the morbid fascination that compelled me to watch, and in that moment, I understood that fear and obedience were not just tools the matriarch wielded, they were the very language of the household. The mother's voice, soft yet unwavering, carried a subtle power that made the daughters flinch and straighten in near-perfect synchrony, as if invisible strings guided their movements. She spoke in tones of encouragement and subtle threat intertwined, a melody of persuasion that forced compliance without ever raising a hand. There was a precision to her control, a methodical orchestration of every glance, every hesitation, every whispered protest that never fully emerged. The daughters, though outwardly graceful and composed, betrayed their torment in small, almost imperceptible ways, the clenching of hands, a flicker of the eyes, the slight tremor of shoulders under the weight of unseen chains. It was clear that this was not merely discipline or the sternness of a strict matriarch, it was domination in its purest, most deliberate form, a power that left no room for autonomy, no room for defiance, and no room for escape. I could feel my own heart thundering as I realized the magnitude of what I was witnessing. This confrontation was not about punishment alone, nor about obedience in the ordinary sense, it was a performance, a careful calibration of fear, shame, and control designed to shape behavior, to ensure that the daughters existed not as individuals but as instruments of their mother's will. The quiet desperation in their movements, the careful mimicry of serenity, was a language I had never been taught to read, yet it spoke with undeniable clarity. The air in the room was electric, taut with tension, and I sensed that the walls themselves held the echoes of countless such encounters, that the very house had absorbed the patterns of control over decades and now pulsed with a life born of domination. I realized then that the plantation was more than a home, it was a prison, a theater of manipulation, and I had crossed the threshold into a story whose depths I could barely comprehend, yet from which there was no turning back. After witnessing the first confrontation, a creeping sense of unease settled over me that I could not shake, a persistent whisper at the edges of my mind urging me to question everything I had seen. At first, I tried to rationalize what I had observed, convincing myself that perhaps the mother's authority over her daughters was merely strict discipline, that the strange tension in the house was the product of propriety rather than something more sinister. Yet the evidence of subtle cruelty and coercion haunted every corner of the plantation, appearing in fleeting details that I could no longer dismiss. The daughters' smiles, so carefully rehearsed, faltered for a fraction of a second when they thought no one watched, their laughter, delicate and melodic, carried an edge of hesitation, as if it had been measured in time to avoid displeasing someone unseen. Every gesture seemed layered with hidden meaning, every glance calculated to communicate obedience or fear, and I began to notice the patterns, the repetitions, the rhythm of control that bound them. The servants, too, gave no comfort. They moved through the halls and fields with furtive glances and careful steps, as though every action had to be weighed before it was performed. In quiet moments, snippets of conversation or fragments of warning would escape their lips, phrases that hinted at compliance enforced by more than simple authority, at punishments that were psychological as much as physical, at nights filled with rituals too terrible to name aloud. I began to see the plantation itself as an accomplice, the architecture of the house, the corridors, the hidden alcoves, all designed to isolate, observe, and manipulate. Even the daughters' rooms, which might have seemed luxurious to an outsider, bore traces of invisible boundaries, locked drawers, curtains drawn tightly, and personal objects arranged in patterns that suggested surveillance rather than comfort. My growing suspicion was impossible to ignore, gnawing at me with a quiet insistence. Each day, new signs appeared that reinforced the fear I tried to suppress, a tremor in a hand as it touched a doorknob, a sudden hush when the mother's shadow passed by, a subtle exchange between daughters that spoke volumes in silence. I realized that the house, the family, and the surrounding woods all operated in concert to maintain a system of control so complete that resistance seemed unthinkable. The rationalizations I had tried to cling to began to crumble, replaced by the uncomfortable acknowledgement that I was witnessing a carefully concealed cruelty, one that had been hidden behind a facade of elegance, beauty, and southern refinement. The truth pressed closer with every glance, every whispered conversation, every fleeting shadow, and I understood that the deeper I looked, the harder it would be to deny the darkness that had long thrived within this isolated estate. It was in a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment that one of the daughters allowed herself to be seen in a way that felt painfully human, as if the carefully constructed mask she wore for her mother's benefit had slipped, if only for a heartbeat. She approached me in the garden under the cover of twilight, the long shadows of oak trees stretching across the flower beds, and her steps were hesitant, measured, as though she feared the very air might betray her presence. Her face was pale in the fading light, and her eyes, those eyes that had seemed so empty in public, now glimmered with a fragile intensity, a quiet plea that resonated in the silence around us. I realized instantly that she wanted to speak, but every word was weighed against the fear that someone might be listening, that a wrong phrase might unleash consequences too severe to endure. Yet she had crossed the invisible line, if only partially, and the trembling in her hands, the slight quiver in her voice, revealed a longing to unburden herself from the suffocating control of her mother. She spoke in hushed tones, choosing words carefully, almost as if each syllable carried the weight of her life. She hinted at nights filled with rituals that were more than discipline, at a pressure that transformed obedience into submission of the mind and body, at the invisible chains that kept her and her sisters bound to a will far greater and more frightening than any earthly authority. She offered fragments of her reality, the subtle manipulations, the moments of silent terror, the gestures of control that her mother wielded with clinical precision. Each confession was partial, incomplete, yet every detail carved the contours of a truth so horrifying that I felt the air grow heavier with it, pressing down as though the forest and the house themselves were leaning in to listen. Her words were warnings, tentative and trembling, meant not to shock or accuse but to signal a shared recognition of the darkness that had defined her existence. Even in her attempt to escape the truth, fear clung to her like a second skin. She cast frequent glances toward the house, toward the tall windows that caught the last rays of light, as if expecting the shadows themselves to shift and reveal the mother's presence. Her hesitation, her careful pacing, and the almost imperceptible trembling of her fingers betrayed the years of control that had been imposed upon her, the subtle conditioning that left no room for genuine spontaneity or rebellion. Yet within those flickers of vulnerability, there was also a quiet defiance, a spark that suggested she might one day resist, even if the price of that resistance was unimaginable. And in that brief encounter, standing amidst the scented flowers and the encroaching darkness of the woods, I felt the weight of both her suffering and her courage, understanding that what she revealed was only a fragment, a glimpse of a hidden life that had been meticulously concealed, yet could no longer remain entirely in shadow. The night arrived heavy and oppressive, a storm rolling in from the coast that twisted the sky into roiling shades of gray and black, sending flashes of lightning slicing through the clouds and illuminating the plantation in jagged bursts. The wind screamed through the trees, bending the gnarled branches like skeletal hands, and the first fat drops of rain pelted the roof and the grounds, creating a relentless rhythm that mirrored the tension building within the house. Inside, the corridor seemed narrower, darker, charged with a sense of anticipation as if the storm had awakened something long dormant. Shadows danced along the walls with each flicker of candlelight, revealing corners that I had never dared to explore, spaces where whispers and movements had been hiding for years. The daughters moved quietly but deliberately, their steps echoing against the polished floors, carrying a weight that spoke of fear, training, and the invisible strings that bound them. The storm drew every sound into sharp relief, the rustle of silk, the clatter of a falling object, the low moan of the wind through cracks in the shutters, and with each noise, the reality of the house's secrets pressed closer. It was then, amid the chaos of nature and the electric tension of human presence, that the truth began to unravel. A single candle flickered violently and went out, leaving a momentary darkness so complete that the house seemed to hold its breath. In that instant, the carefully maintained facade of control cracked, a muffled cry, a hurried shuffle, and the barely audible sound of someone, or something, being moved through the hidden corridors. The daughter's composure faltered, a tremor of recognition passing between them, and I understood that the rituals and commands I had glimpsed before were about to collide with the unpredictable fury of the storm, the isolation of the plantation, and the fragile courage that had begun to awaken within them. Every shadow seemed to pulse, every whispered sound magnified, and the house itself felt alive, almost predatory, as if it had been waiting for this night to reveal the culmination of decades of secrecy. The wind tore at doors and windows, forcing them to rattle and groan, while the forest beyond the property echoed with low, menacing groans, as if bearing witness to the events unfolding inside. The daughters moved closer together, hesitant and fearful, yet a subtle defiance flickered in their eyes, a spark of rebellion that trembled against the weight of the mother's influence. I could sense the invisible threads of control being tested, the fragile tension between obedience and resistance stretching to its limit, and the night itself seemed to conspire with the revelations, amplifying every fear, every suppressed scream, every hidden truth that had long been buried behind polished walls and polite manners.